Science of Winning Podcast, episode number 3. Hello, sports champions. Welcome again to the Science of Winning Podcast, your number one source for learning how to win in your sport. Where each week we dive into the minds of championship-winning athletes and coaches to discover how champions think and what they do to achieve athletic success. I am your host, Lyndon Gortney. Now, if you're ready to dominate your position, outsmart your opponent, crush the competition, win more games, and achieve your athletic goals, then I've got a free gift for you. Head on over to sportstrainingsecrets.com, where you can download the first 3 chapters of my book, How to Win at Sports, 10 Proven Principles Marines Use to Win in Battle. Alright guys, I'm so glad to have you back again with us today. We're going to start by recapping our last episode. Just like practice where we repeat skills and activities, we are going to repeat these principles so that they sink into your mind, so that you can master them and so that you can use them in competition. So, in our last episode, we introduced you to the big 3, the first 3 principles of winning in sports, the big 3 I call them. The very first one is to find your opponent's weakness and attack it. The second one is to stick with what's working. The third one is to find your opponent's strength and neutralize it or shut it down. Alright, so last time we talked about finding your opponent's weakness and attacking it. We talked about how every athlete and every team has a weakness. We talked about the different types of weaknesses that athletes have, that teams have, and the 3 types were their physical, their mental, and their tendencies. These are 3 weaknesses that you can attack and exploit. We also talked about questions that you can use for pre-game when you're building your game plan to play against your opponent. We also talked about questions for during the game, say at halftime or between periods or between quarters, that you can ask yourself to give you keys, to give you answers to find your opponent's weakness and attack it, to give you the greatest chance of winning that game. All right, today we're going to be talking about the second of the big 3 winning principles, the proven principles of winning. We are going to be talking about sticking with what's working. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was over in Iraq in 2004. I was deployed to Fallujah. And during that time, many of my fellow Marines would deploy for 6 months or so at a time. And they would be over there in Iraq and in the surrounding communities around Fallujah, Al-Assad, Al-Taqadim, these different places. And they were there to fight the enemy. Now, about a month or so before their 6-month deployment ended, the next group of Marines would start arriving to start their 6-month rotation. Now, during that month of overlap, the off-going Marines would teach the oncoming Marines what was happening. They would teach them what's working and what isn't against the enemy. Now, many of the oncoming Marines ended up going to Iraq 3 or 4 times throughout Operation Iraqi Freedom. But every time that they went back into theater, every time they went back into the combat zone, they would do the exact same thing. You would have a thorough relief with the off-going Marine force. Now let me ask you a question. What would happen if the oncoming Marines said, "Guys, don't worry about letting us know what's happening out here. We've been here before. We know how to do this. So you guys just go home and head on out and we'll take it from here." They would most likely try to rely on old tactics, which the enemy had already adapted for, and many of them would end up getting killed. What worked in the past doesn't always mean it will work in the present or in the future, especially if the enemy is smart and is always adjusting their strategy to attack or defend against you. It is vital for Marines, when going into a combat zone, to find out from the off-going force how the enemy is attacking, what tactics they're using against us, and what tactics we're using that are working against our enemy. This lets them know what is working now, not what was working 6 months ago. Once they find out what's working, they stick with it until the enemy adjusts, and then they find a new strategy that works, and then they stick with that. Now, I want to go into a sports story. I want to show you how this correlates over into athletics and athletic competition. In 2000, the Oklahoma Sooners football team won the national championship. It was a great year. Being a Sooners fan, I was just in heaven on cloud 9 watching my guys go and win the whole thing and take home the national championship. During the next several years after that, they had several amazing teams. Great recruiting. They had great athletes. They were so talented. They were so fast. They would run this awesome spread offense where they would get the ball. Let's say they got on a touchback, so they get on the 20-yard line back then. I think it's the 25-yard line now or so on a touchback. But they would get the ball, and they would spread out the defense with 5 wide receivers. And they had some phenomenal quarterbacks, and they would absolutely pick apart defenses. They would move down the entire field 50, 60, 70 yards in just a flash. I mean, a matter of seconds. They were so good at getting down the field and picking the other team apart. However, once they got down into the red zone, their offensive coordinator would do something that never really worked for him. It was so frustrating to watch because instead of this, they would run this hurry-up offense, this hurry-up spread offense where everybody's spread out. They would snap the ball, make a pass, rush up to the line, no huddle, snap the ball again, make another pass, rush up to the line. But once they got down into the red zone, they slowed the game down. They would look over at the sideline. They would use their full play clock. They would look over the sideline 2 or 3 times sometimes, and often ended up running 3 running plays, basically right up the middle, and get stopped and end up having to settle for a field goal. They just could not put the ball in the end zone with regularity. Even though they had these amazing weapons at quarterback and wide receiver, they still tried to do this strategy time and time again, and it never worked. What should they have done? Obviously, they should have stuck with what's working. When they were in their hurry-up offense, when they were doing no-huddle offense, when they were spreading the defense out, they would get their opponents on their heels, gasping for air. They wouldn't have time to settle in. They wouldn't have time to see what offense and what routes were being run. They wouldn't be able to hear what plays being called and make adjustments by seeing those plays time and time again. Their heads were spinning, and they were just trying to stay in front of the defenders because the offense was moving so quickly and so fast and had them so spread out. But slowing it down, it gave the defense a chance to catch their breath. It gave them a chance to set their defensive play to attack OU's offensive play, and they ended up stopping OU more often than not. Needless to say, for the next several years, they didn't win any championships. In fact, they haven't won one since. So there's an example of a team who did not stick with what's working, even though it worked so often for them throughout their entire season. They would get down to this red zone and they would just completely change their strategy, and it didn't work out for them. All right. Moving on, I want to tell you about a baseball story from my own personal playing. When I was playing baseball, I was a pitcher. I played a lot of different positions. I pitched, I caught, I played some third base, I played some shortstop, played some outfield. They kind of had me all over the field at times. I tried to be that utility player just because I loved every position, and I loved playing the game so much. So one year I was up in Nebraska, and I got to play baseball with my older brother. In college. We played all growing up. He was 2 years older than me, but he asked me to come up there and go to school with him his senior year so we could play ball together one last time. So I went up and went to school with him, and we ended up playing a road game up in Nebraska in March. And let me tell you, it was cold. They had one of those big heaters that you see now on the sidelines of professional football teams, where NFL football, where they've got, it basically looks like a jet engine kind of sitting there with the flame shooting out of this big old 12-inch tube, and with air being sucked in and pushed through, just blow this hot air across there. They had one of those in our dugout, and I basically spent any time I wasn't out there on the field, I camped out right in front of that heater. So anyway, so here we were in Nebraska playing against a really good team up there, and I was starting pitcher for the day. Now, I had several different pitches, but for that day, the only thing that was really working for me was my fastball and my changeup. My fastball, I had really good command. I could put it where I wanted to. And my changeup, for whatever reason, was dropping like 6 inches that day, sometimes even 9 inches. The thing would just, the bottom would fall right out of it. It was so fun. I hadn't had it drop that much all season. I don't know if it was the cold air or Nebraska. I don't know what it was, but it was really nice. My changeup was dropping like crazy. So I usually had a nice curveball, but for whatever reason that day, it really wasn't working. So the only 2 pitches I really had going for me that day was my fastball and my changeup. So knowing that, I put together a little strategy that I started using. I would start out the inning typically by putting a fastball in on their hands, real tight on the inside part of the plate. Try to give as much on it as I could, show them I had a little bit of speed, a little bit of power. I didn't really have that much speed, but I tried to at least get in their head and make them think I did. So I followed that with a changeup on the inside of the plate that they would often hit, but because they'd seen my fastball, their timing was a little bit thrown off, so they were usually early on the ball. So they would pull it foul down the third baseline, or if they were a lefty, they would pull it foul down the first baseline. But so I'd get my next strike, or I'd get at least my first strike with that changeup on the inside. Then I'd come at them again on the inside part of the plate, another fastball in their hands, once again trying to throw off their timing, going fast, slow, so they couldn't really get my timing. Lastly, I would usually finish them off with a changeup, or what was that day turned out to be more of a sinker, that I would throw on the outside part of the plate. And it would drop several inches again. I would either start it high and drop it into the strike zone, or I would start it in the bottom of the strike zone and let it drop out. And let's just say it was working for me. They would typically swing right over the top of that pitch and end up striking out, or maybe top it and get a ground ball, but we'd get him out of first base. So through 5 innings, I'd only given up 2 hits, and we were actually beating this team 5-0, 5 runs to 0. So for some reason, my coach pulled me out of the game and decided to pitch another player. I don't know why. I don't know what he was doing, but he just thought, hey, for whatever reason, I'm going to throw this other player. So the other guy got warmed up and got in there, and the other team, our opponents, dialed in on this guy, and they just hit him all over the park. We ended up losing the game 5 runs to 6. Obviously, if our coach had stuck with what's working, we most likely would have ended up winning that game. So let me tell you another story. I started this story in our introductory episode and then gave you a little bit more insight there in episode number 2. But I want to continue on with this story so that you guys can see this ongoing process and how to use these principles. So back to this adult league basketball that I was playing. I told my guys at halftime we were basically tied up against our opponents. And I asked my guys if they would mind trying some of these proven principles that I've been studying in my master's program to see if it would help us win the game. These guys said, absolutely, let's give it a whirl. So I laid out the first 3 principles. Find the opponent's weakness and attack it, stick with what's working, and find your opponent's strength and neutralize it. So we did the find their weakness and attack it. The next part was stick with what's working. So we sit down and we ask, okay, what has been working? How have we been scoring? Well, for us in that game, the way we had been scoring was to drive past our opponent, to get into the paint, and either shoot a short jumper, a layup, or dish it off to your teammate there in the paint for an easy layup. That's what had been working. We also looked at what had not been working. Even though our team was we had a bunch of good shooters on our team, that day we could not hit any outside shots. In fact, we didn't make a single 3-pointer the entire game, at least the entire first half. So we said, all right, guys, what's working? It's getting inside, getting in the paint, making short shots or short passes for an easy layup. What isn't working? Outside shots. Okay, let's do more of what's working. Let's stick with it. And let's stop doing what isn't working. Let's take no more outside shots. No more 3-pointers the rest of the game. And as you heard in the previous episodes, we obviously finished out that game in the second half. We blew out our opponent, ended up beating him by 20 points there in just the second half. So we'll get on to more of that story in the next episode when we talk about our third principle of winning, finding their strength and shutting it down. But I just want to keep this story going so you guys see how we applied it. Even in the middle of a game, even with athletes who had never heard of these principles, it still worked amazingly. Last story I want to tell you. I started it in this last episode as well, in episode 2. I talked about playing basketball, driveway basketball against my younger brother Lance. And I talked to you about how that if I wanted to win 100% of the time, I should use my strength against his weakness. I had this advantage where I was good 6 inches taller than him. I could have backed him down underneath the rim, turned around, and shot an uncontested shot because he couldn't even get up high enough to block my shot. Now, to win 100% of the time, I should have stuck with what worked, right? I should have kept doing that, and it would have guaranteed me a win. Now, I want to note here that there are times that coaches want to develop different skills in real game situations. Or maybe they want to get some playing time for players who don't play very often. Or even there's times when coaches want to work on specific plays against live competition. Some coaches even want to put their team behind on purpose to see how they battle back. Or sometimes coaches even want to see their team lose in order to develop character or to give them a reality check. Maybe they're getting arrogant and cocky, and the coach wants to make sure they get brought back down to earth and cut back down to size. Now, in these situations, winning is no longer the primary goal. In these situations, make the choices that produce the goal you want to achieve. If you want to develop those skills, if you want to practice those plays, if you want to get these players in the game, if you want to develop mental toughness with your athletes and watch them battle back from being behind, go for it. But just know that if winning is the goal, then you find out what's working and you stick with it until it stops working or until the game's over. That's how you win games, and that is how you apply this second principle of winning, which is to stick with what's working. Now here's a sad fact. Most coaches and most athletes are not even aware of what's working during a game. They're not even paying attention. Oftentimes they're focused on maybe their game plan. Maybe the coach lays out a game plan of what he wants his team to do this game, and athletes are focused on running the play and making sure they're in the right position. The coach is saying, all right, we've got to run these 4 plays. We've got to run these 4 plays. And the players are trying to remember those plays, and their attention is on that playbook and on being at the right spot at the right time, to execute that play. Maybe the focus is on getting an open shot, or maybe their focus is on defense, maybe switching between man-to-man defense or zone defenses. Maybe they're focused on running different plays to create variation. Sometimes the coach wants to, let's say in football, he's switching back and forth from running plays to passing plays, from short passes to long passes, from running inside between the linemen to running outside and bouncing outside the linemen. There's all kinds of different things that coaches and players are often focused on during the game. But so often, they are not focused on what is actually working against their opponent. Sometimes these players or coaches think, if we just stick to the game plan, it'll eventually work out and we'll probably win the game. But this is false. It takes more than this to win. You have to pay attention to what's working, and you've got to do more of that. See, here's the problem with this way of thinking of we'll just stick to the game plan and just stick to how it's always worked out, and we'll just keep going with it, and not being aware of your opponent and not being aware of what's actually working. The thing is, we are all humans, and every single one of us have bad days or have off days. Sometimes your all-star player gets cold. You can't make a shot, can't make a pitch, can't score, fumbles the ball, can't catch anything. All-stars, even the best, even the greatest in the world, have bad games. And sometimes your bench warmers or your support players get red hot and they play like all-stars and they keep scoring. If you are relying on a specific game plan or a specific star on your team, and for whatever reason it isn't working out that day, or if you have an all-star who's having a bad day, then you are in trouble. You are most likely not going to win. You have to pay attention to what's working. I can't tell you how many times I have heard coaches say to maybe one of their good shooters, hey, you just keep shooting them up there. You just keep shooting them up there. Keep shooting them up there. And they end up losing the game because that player, for whatever reason, was having an off day shooting. I'm talking about basketball specifically or soccer specifically. They just can't get the ball on goal or they can't get the ball through the rim. So you have to pay attention to what's working. So here's the key to executing this second principle of winning. The key to sticking with what's working. There's 2 parts to it. Number 1, you have to have a good memory. I'm talking short-term memory of during that game, and even in past times you played against them, but specifically a good short-term memory for that game. Coaches and players need to be aware of what is succeeding and what is failing, of plays they've tried that worked, of plays they tried that didn't work, of players who are red hot and players who are cold. They have to be aware of this. Now, this takes intentional effort to get good at. You have to pay attention and you have to remember. You can't be distracted by all the extra things of having your focus off on plays or off on executing a skill or something. Those types of things need to be practiced so often that they become second nature. If a play gets called, you can run the play without even thinking about it. If it's time for you to execute a pitch or a shot or a route, you can execute that skill without even thinking about it. That's why repetition and practice is so vital, because during the game, you want your mental faculties to be freed up. You want to have your brain space, your hard drive freed up so it can focus on these other things, like paying attention to what's working and what isn't working and remembering. So when I play men's league softball, I often will, every time I play, and I've been doing this for the past several years, I wish I had learned this back when I was a kid or playing in high school or even playing in college, because often I didn't even do this in college. But over the last several years, this has been something that's been really key to the success of our team. I try to memorize where every player on that other team, that opposing team, where they hit the ball. Now, it's slow pitch softball, so the pitcher's kind of taken out of the equation. It's not that he doesn't really have the power to force a guy to push a ball or force a guy to pull a ball. So wherever the ball goes, typically in slow pitch softball, that's where the person's going to naturally hit again and again. I can't tell you how many times where we have gone through the first, the lineup, and I've made a mental note of every one of these players where they hit the ball. Then the next time they come up to bat, I can point out to my players, he pulled it down the left field line. He put that in the gap. He hit it over the top. He dropped it in front of the left fielder. He hit it down the right field line. He blooped it. He's a push hitter. He's a pull hitter. I can tell them where that player hit the ball last time, and we can adjust our infield and outfield to defend against that guy's natural swing and what he's done in the past. There have been times where we have, just like the pros do it in the Major League Baseball, where we have played 3 infielders on one side of the field playing a hitter to pull the ball, because we've seen him on multiple occasions do nothing but pull the ball. So we say, we're going to gamble and we're going to risk, and we're going to say, I don't think you can hit the ball to the opposite side of the field. I think all you can do is pull. So we put all of our players on that one side of the field, and I can't tell you how many times that has worked out where they would have got a base hit, but because of our shift on the infield, we have pulled up the ground ball and thrown the guy out at first base or caught a line drive. We've also done things like putting somebody. We played against a team that kept hitting a ball right over the shortstop and right in front of the left fielder and the left center fielder. They just kept blooping it in, dropping it in. So what did we do? We played 3 outfielders and 1 rover. We pulled that left center fielder up and stuck him back just behind the shortstop. That rover ended up making about 6 or 7 outs throughout the rest of the game, which ended up winning us the game easily because we made the adjustment. We saw what the other team was doing, and we adjusted to it, and we started doing what was working. Another example, in basketball, you've got to remember how you've scored as a team and as an individual. If you as a player, as an individual, have scored by getting around your defender, by dribbling past him, keep doing that. If you have had most success by doing off-the-ball screens or pick and rolls or getting open, sitting in the corner for a three-point shot, whatever has been working, keep doing that. As a team, you have to look at how we as a team have scored against the opponents. Do we have a certain player on our team that has scored most of our points? If so, how has that player scored most of our points? Has it been our center? Has he been getting the ball down low on the block and going one-on-one against his defender and scored that way? Has it been a point guard blowing past everybody and getting into the paint and then dishing it off to a forward for an easy layup? How have we been scoring as a team? You've got to pay attention to that so that you can repeat it. Sometimes you score by getting inside the paint and then dishing it back out for an outside shot. Sometimes it's by getting down to the short corner to a baseline runner, and that sucks the defense down, then he kicks it back to somebody in the paint or at the top of the key or in the corner. You've just got to pay attention to what's working and continue to do more of it. In football, you've got to remember how they play your routes. Do they cover the inside and try to go for the interception? Do they cover the outside and give you the middle? You've got to find out Who on your team is open the most? Do you have a certain corner that's weak, leaving a wide receiver open a good majority of the time? You have to know which lineman is making consistent running lanes. In SEC football, they run the ball because it works for them. They are happy with getting 3 yards at a time because that gets them the first downs they need to eventually score touchdowns. They found out what works for them. They've got these big, powerful linemen that can create gaps, that can push the line and get the ball moving downfield and just chip away a little bit at a time, chip away yards and end up winning games. All right, soccer. You've got to remember how you've gotten open shots. Has it been from corner kicks? Has it been from crosses? Has it been getting the ball down to the touch line, near the goal line, and then rolling a back out across the middle of the 18-yard line or across the box? Has it been doing fast break type, against the run and play type passes where your strikers are up at midfield, and once you get forced to turnover, you send it long over the top so that your striker gets behind the defense and goes one-on-one with the goalie? You've got to remember how you've got your shots. Volleyball, for example, you need to find out which hitters on your team have gotten the most kills. You got to find out you got to pay attention to which blockers on the opponent's team are weak or are short or are out of position or are too slow. You've got to find out which back row defenders have a hard time digging the ball, which ones have a hard time passing. You've got to find out who are the poor serve returners so you can serve them the ball the most often. You've got to find out again who are the bad passers. You want to put the ball on their hands the majority of the time, especially whenever you can't get a kill shot and you have to pass it over. You want to find that bad passer. Now in MMA, you've got to pay attention to which combos you're throwing that land. You've got to find out, am I able to strike his lead leg with kicks anytime I want? Are you able to throw a jab and then come with a cross or a hook or an uppercut that lands most of the time? You got to find out how they defend the takedown. If they drop their guard when you show a takedown attempt, they drop their guard, they may leave their face wide open. But if you don't pay attention to that, you're not going to know to fake a shot and then come with an uppercut or a cross or a straight hard jab right down the pike. You've got to also pay attention to the angles of attack that get you good strikes. If you're coming straight at your opponent and they're able to defend that every time, well, you want to stop doing that. Maybe get out to one side and then come back in. You've got to pay attention to the weaknesses of your opponent. You've got to pay attention to what's working. So that paying attention and that memory is the very first key to learning how to stick with what's working. You've got to be aware, you've got to be observant, and you've got to remember it so that you can apply it. The other way to stick with what's working, the other technique you need is the data. You need a stat keeper. For sports teams, you need to assign somebody, an assistant coach, just a pure stats keeper, or even one of the players on the bench to sit there and record what types of things have worked, what types of plays have worked, who's doing the most scoring, how have they scored. Your basic game stat keeper is going to keep a basic tally of who scored the ball and the number of points. But they're not keeping a track of, did they score by scoring from the right side of the court, from the left side of the court, from the corner, the elbow, inside the paint, on the right side, on the left side, doing post moves, running baseline, doing fast breaks, etc., etc. I'm talking a little bit of basketball here, but you get the idea for any sport. You've got to find out not just who is scoring, but how they scored. So your stat keeper, your data keeper has to figure out and keep stats of how that's worked. Not just who, but how. If you can have that data, that is your written memory. So it makes it a little bit easier for those that have a hard time actually physically remembering, observing and remembering, because maybe they're distracted, focused on the play or focused on executing a skill. How many times have you watched an MMA fight where the fighter will go over to his corner between rounds and his coaches are giving him data? They're giving him stats as to what's worked and what hasn't worked. They're saying things like, hey, he's getting the jab, so come with the cross. Or, hey, keep striking that lead leg, you're weakening it. Or, hey, he hasn't stopped a single one of your takedown attempts, take him down. Or, he's dropping his hand when you move to the left, so, have him move to the left and then drop a punch in where he's dropping his guard or his block. You get the point. Data keepers will help give you the information you need to see what's working, to see how you've succeeded, and to continue doing more of that. So let's get to the questions part of that. These are questions that you need to use to figure out what's working so that you can stick with it. So here's question number 1. How have we been successful? Question number 2. How have we scored? Question 3. Who on our team has scored the most? Or what type of attack have we used that scored the most? 3. What's been working? 4. What's not been working? What's not been working this game or even the entire season? And 5. What do we need to do to increase the chances that we will succeed again in the future? These are easy questions to answer if you have paid attention and remembered it. Remembered what you've seen during the game. So how have we been successful? Who has scored? Who's scored the most? What's been working? What's not been working? And what do we need to do to increase the chance that we'll succeed again? If you ask yourself these questions and you apply the answers that you get from asking these questions, I guarantee you, you will increase the number of wins you get and greatly increase your chance of winning in any sport. Now, during the course of this podcast, we want to always be improving and finding better ways to help you, the athlete, the coach, and the parent. If you see some ways that we can improve this podcast, if there are questions you have, or if there are ways that we can just serve you better and add more value to you, please reach out to us on Facebook. Just go to facebook.com/Science of Winning Podcast, or put in the search bar, Science of Winning Podcast. Now, if you have a sport or a position that you would like more information on, that you would like us to break down how to apply these principles in your sport and in your position, let us know. Just again, go to our Facebook page, Science of Winning Podcast. Just post your question there, and we will be happy to answer your question in either a podcast episode or on our Facebook page. And if you go to our Facebook page and you make a post or ask a question, we'd love to give you a shout out in our next podcast episode. Now, I am super excited to hear about your dreams and to help you achieve them. Now, I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to think of 5 athletes or coaches or parents of athletes, competitive athletes, that you think would benefit from this podcast, and forward them the link to this podcast or this episode right now. It will show them that you care about their success, and it will help them improve their chances of winning in the future. As always, please subscribe to our podcast, give our episode a rating so that we know which ones you like and which ones we can improve upon. Once again, thank you for listening. This is Lyndon Gortney, and you are listening to The Science of Winning.